On a frozen morning in February 1945, somewhere along the snow-covered rail lines cutting through occupied Belgium, a German military convoy carrying more than 300 Allied prisoners of war and critical ammunition supplies was racing toward the Western Front. The train was moving at full speed, its locomotive belching black smoke into the grey winter sky, its cargo a mix of human suffering and instruments of death. But that train never reached its destination. It didn't derail because of sabotage by experienced resistance fighters. It didn't stop because of an Allied bombing raid. It ground to a catastrophic halt because a 10-year-old boy named Marcel Dury climbed onto the frozen tracks in the dead of night, found the manual rail switch with his bare hands, and threw it with every ounce of strength his small body could muster. This is the story they don't teach in history class. This is the story of how one child, armed with nothing but desperation and a heart too brave for his age, became the wrench in the Nazi war machine. Most people don't know that children were the invisible soldiers of World War II. While adults joined formal resistance networks, built bombs in cellars and coordinated with Allied intelligence, it was often the kids who moved unseen through occupied Europe. They were too young to be suspected, too small to be noticed, and too innocent-looking to be searched. In Belgium, by 1944, the Nazi occupation had become a suffocating nightmare. The country had been under German control since May 1940, and by the time the Allies began their push through France, the Nazis were tightening their grip on every rail line, every road, every escape route. Trains became lifelines for the Third Reich. They carried troops to the front, weapons to the battlefield, and prisoners to camps. The Belgian rail system was a spiderweb of steel, and every junction, every switch, every signal was a potential choke point. The Nazis knew this. They guarded the major stations with armed patrols, attack dogs, and searchlights. But they couldn't guard everything. They couldn't watch every lonely stretch of track cutting through the frozen Ardennes forest. And that's where Marcel Dury lived. Marcel was not a soldier. He was not a spy. He was a 10-year-old boy living in a small village near the town of Liège, in the eastern part of Belgium, where the forests were deep and the winters were brutal. His father had been taken by the Nazis 2 years earlier, shipped off to a forced labor camp in Germany. His mother worked in a textile factory that had been seized by the occupation and was now producing uniforms for Wehrmacht soldiers. Marcel's world had shrunk to the size of his village, his school, and the narrow dirt path that led from his home to the rail line that ran less than a kilometer away. He knew those tracks. Every kid in the village knew them. They had played near them before the war, watched the passenger trains roll by, waved at the conductors. But now the trains carried something else. Now the trains carried death. In early February 1945, word spread through the village in whispers. A resistance courier, a woman no one knew by name, had slipped into the local church and left a message with the priest. A massive German convoy was scheduled to pass through their region in 3 days. The train would be carrying Allied prisoners, men who had survived the Battle of the Bulge and were being transferred deeper into Germany. It would also be carrying munitions, supplies the Nazis desperately needed as the Soviets closed in from the east and the Americans and British from the west. The message was clear. If someone could stop that train, even for a few hours, it could save lives. It could delay a shipment that might turn the tide of a skirmish. It could matter. But the resistance network in the area had been compromised. 2 weeks earlier, the Gestapo had rounded up 7 members of the local cell. The adults who remained were being watched. They couldn't move. They couldn't act. And so the message reached the only person desperate enough and small enough to try. Marcel Dury heard the plan from his mother's friend, a woman named Elise who had been hiding resistance pamphlets in her attic. Elise didn't ask Marcel to do anything. She simply told him the truth. She told him about the train, about the prisoners, about the switch located 2 kilometers south of the village near the old stone bridge. She told him that if someone could throw that switch, the train would be diverted onto a maintenance siding, a dead-end track that led to an abandoned rail yard. The train would stop. The prisoners might have a chance. The munitions would be delayed. She didn't tell him to go. She didn't have to. Marcel had already lost his father. He had watched his mother come home every night with her hands stained black from dye, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. He had seen his neighbors dragged into the street and shot for hiding food. He had lived through 4 years of occupation, and he knew what the Nazis were. He knew what they did. And so on the night of February 14th, 1945, Marcel Dury tied his father's old wool scarf around his neck, slipped out of his house while his mother slept, and began walking toward the rail line. The temperature that night was 15 degrees below zero. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind cut through the trees like a blade. Marcel carried no weapon. He had no radio. He didn't even have a flashlight because the batteries had run out months ago. All he had was the knowledge of where the switch was, the memory of playing near those tracks as a child, and the belief that if he didn't do this, no one else would. The walk took him nearly an hour. His boots, 2 sizes too big and stuffed with newspaper, crunched through the frozen crust of snow. His breath came out in white clouds. Twice, he heard the distant sound of a German patrol vehicle on the main road and had to throw himself into a ditch, pressing his face into the ice until the sound faded. But he kept moving, and when he finally reached the switch, he stood there in the darkness, staring at the iron lever covered in frost, and realized that the hardest part was just beginning. The rail switch was older than Marcel, a relic from before the war when Belgian railways were still run by Belgians and not by the Nazi Reichsbahn. It stood waist-high to the boy, a manual lever made of cast iron, designed to be operated by a grown man with tools and proper leverage. In the summer it might have been manageable, but in the dead of winter, the mechanism was seized by ice and rust. The metal so cold it burned to touch even through Marcel's threadbare gloves. He grabbed the lever with both hands and pulled. Nothing. He planted his feet in the snow, leaned back with all his weight and pulled again. The lever didn't budge. His hands were already going numb. His breath came in ragged gasps. For a moment, the absurdity of it all crashed down on him. He was a 10-year-old boy trying to move a piece of industrial machinery that weighed more than he did in the middle of the night in sub-zero temperatures, with a Nazi convoy scheduled to pass through in less than 8 hours. But Marcel didn't leave. He couldn't. Because somewhere on that train, there were men who were someone's father, someone's brother, someone's son. And if he walked away now, he would never forgive himself. He searched the ground around the switch and found a length of rusted chain half buried in the snow, probably left behind by a work crew years ago. He looped the chain around the lever, wrapped the other end around his wrists, and threw his entire body backward. The chain bit into his skin, his boots slipped on the ice, and then, with a sound like a gunshot, the lever moved. Just a few inches, but it moved. Marcel didn't stop. He pulled again and again, each time gaining a little more ground, each time feeling the mechanism slowly give way. His wrists were bleeding, his lungs burned, but the lever was shifting, and after what felt like an eternity, it finally locked into place with a heavy metallic clunk. The switch had been thrown. The track had been changed. The convoy, when it arrived, would be diverted onto the dead-end siding. Marcel stood there for a moment, shaking, staring at what he had just done. Then he heard it, the distant, unmistakable sound of an engine. The train was coming early. Panic flooded through him. The train wasn't supposed to arrive until dawn, but the Germans had changed their schedule, likely to avoid partisan activity. Marcel could see the faint glow of the locomotive's headlamp, cutting through the darkness, maybe 3 kilometers away and closing fast. He had minutes, maybe less. If he ran now, he could make it back to the village before anyone saw him. But if he ran, there was a chance the Germans would notice the switch had been moved. There was a chance they would stop the train, inspect the tracks, and reverse the lever. All of this would have been for nothing. So Marcel did the only thing he could think of. He stayed. He crouched down in the frozen ditch beside the tracks, pulled his scarf over his face, and pressed his body into the snow. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. The sound of the train grew louder, the ground beginning to vibrate beneath him. He could hear the hiss of steam, the grinding of steel wheels on frozen rails. And then the locomotive roared past him so close he could feel the heat radiating from its firebox, so loud it drowned out every other sound in the world. The train hit the diverted track at full speed. For a moment, nothing happened. The locomotive followed the curve of the switch exactly as it was designed to do, pulling the long line of freight cars and passenger carriages behind it. But then, as the train realized it was no longer on the main line, the engineer slammed on the brakes. The wheels locked. Sparks flew from the rails. The entire convoy began to scream in protest, metal shrieking against metal, as ton after ton of German war machine fought against its own momentum. The train didn't derail, it didn't crash, but it did exactly what Marcel had hoped it would do. It stopped, dead in the middle of the maintenance siding, surrounded by snow-covered trees and rusted equipment. Miles from the nearest station, the Nazi convoy ground to a complete and total halt. And in the darkness, pressed into the frozen earth, Marcel Dury allowed himself one small shaking breath of relief. But the night was far from over. Within seconds, German soldiers began pouring out of the carriages, shouting orders in a language Marcel didn't fully understand. Flashlights swept across the snow. Dogs barked. Someone fired a flare into the sky, bathing the entire scene in sickly red light. Marcel didn't move, he barely breathed. He could hear boots crunching through the snow, moving closer to his hiding spot. And then a voice, harsh and commanding, barked out an order. They were searching for saboteurs. They were searching for him. And Marcel knew that if they found him, if they discovered what he had done, they wouldn't just kill him. They would kill everyone in his village. His mother, Elise, the priest, everyone. The Nazis didn't forgive acts of resistance, they made examples. And so, as the soldiers fanned out across the rail yard, Marcel made a decision. He couldn't stay hidden forever. He had to move. He had to run, and he had to do it now. Marcel waited until the nearest soldier turned his back, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the opposite side of the tracks. Then, moving with a silence born of pure terror, the boy began to crawl. Not toward the village, that would be too obvious, but deeper into the forest parallel to the rail line, toward a drainage culvert he knew ran beneath the tracks about half a kilometer east. His father had shown it to him years ago, back when they used to fish in the stream that fed into it. The culvert was narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man, but Marcel was small. If he could reach it, he could slip under the tracks and emerge on the far side, away from the search parties. His hands and knees scraped against frozen roots and jagged stones. Every breath felt too loud. Behind him, the chaos at the train continued. Officers were screaming at each other, trying to understand what had happened. Someone had discovered the switched lever. More flares went up, turning the night into a flickering nightmare of red and orange light. Marcel could hear the dogs now, their barking growing more frenzied. They had picked up a scent. Whether it was his or someone else's, he didn't know. But he couldn't stop moving. He reached the culvert just as a searchlight from the train swept across the tree line above him. Marcel threw himself into the opening, the icy water inside soaking through his clothes instantly. The cold was so intense, it felt like being stabbed. His entire body seized up, his muscles locking in shock. But he forced himself forward, inch by agonizing inch, crawling through the darkness of the concrete tube. The sound of the dogs was louder now, echoing through the culvert. They were at the entrance. Marcel could hear their claws scraping against the stone. A soldier shouted something, and a flashlight beam stabbed into the tunnel. Marcel pressed himself flat against the bottom of the culvert, his face submerged in the freezing water, holding his breath until his lungs screamed. The light swept over him once, twice, and then miraculously it moved away. The soldier had decided the tunnel was too small, too flooded, too unlikely. He called the dogs back, and Marcel, shaking so violently he could barely control his limbs, began crawling again. It took him 20 minutes to reach the other side. When he finally emerged, gasping and soaked, he collapsed into the snow. He couldn't stay there. The cold would kill him faster than the Germans. Marcel forced himself to stand, his legs barely responding, and began staggering through the forest toward the village. He had no idea how long he walked. Time had stopped meaning anything. His vision was blurring. His fingers had gone completely numb. At some point, he realized he could no longer feel his feet, but he kept moving, one step, then another, guided only by the faint memory of the path he had taken to reach the tracks. When he finally saw the dim outline of his village through the trees, he almost cried. But there was no time for relief. because as he approached the edge of the forest, he saw them. German soldiers, 3 of them, standing in the village square, rifles slung over their shoulders, talking to the priest. They were asking questions. They were looking for someone. They were looking for the person who had sabotaged the train. And Marcel knew with absolute certainty that if he walked into that village now, wet and shaking and covered in mud, he would be shot on sight. So he didn't go home. Instead, he turned and stumbled toward the old barn at the edge of Elise's property, a structure so decrepit the Germans had deemed it worthless and left it alone. He slipped through a gap in the rotted wood and collapsed into a pile of moldy hay. His body was shutting down. Hypothermia was setting in. His thoughts were becoming fuzzy, disconnected. He tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was too powerful. The last thing Marcel remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of a truck engine in the distance, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, he had bought those prisoners enough time. Maybe someone would come for them. Maybe his impossible act would mean something. And then the world went black. When Marcel opened his eyes again, it was daylight. Pale winter sun was streaming through the cracks in the barn walls. He was covered in blankets that hadn't been there before, and Elise was sitting beside him, her face etched with worry and something else. Pride. She didn't say anything at first. She just pressed a tin cup of hot broth into his frozen hands and waited for him to drink. When he finally found his voice, the first thing Marcel asked was whether the prisoners had been freed. Elise's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. The train had been stuck on the siding for 6 hours. By the time the Germans had cleared the track and prepared to move, an Allied reconnaissance unit, alerted by local resistance, had arrived. There had been a firefight. The Germans had retreated. And 247 Allied soldiers had been liberated, because a 10-year-old boy had thrown a switch in the dark. But Marcel's story didn't end with that dawn. The Germans were not the kind of enemy to simply accept defeat and move on. Within hours of the prisoners' liberation, the Gestapo descended on the region like a plague. They set up roadblocks on every route out of the village. They interrogated anyone who had been within 5 kilometers of the rail line. They brought in specialists, men trained in investigating sabotage, who examined the switched lever, measured the footprints in the snow, and analyzed the rusted chain Marcel had used. What they discovered made them furious. The footprints were small, child-sized. The chain showed signs of having been pulled with minimal strength, repeatedly, desperately. And the timing of the sabotage, so precise, so impossibly brave, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. The Nazis knew they weren't looking for a trained resistance fighter. They were looking for a local. And more specifically, they were looking for a child. The village was placed under lockdown. No one in, no one out. Every family was ordered to present their children for inspection. The Gestapo believed that whoever had sabotaged the train would show signs of exposure, frostbite, injuries from the struggle with the frozen lever. They were hunting for a hero, and they were very, very close to finding him. Elise understood the danger immediately. Marcel's hands were torn and bleeding. His wrists bore deep bruises from the chain. His clothes, still damp and hidden in the barn, reeked of the culvert's stagnant water. If the Germans saw him even for a moment, they would know. And so Elise did what the resistance had always done when faced with impossible odds. She lied. She told her neighbors that Marcel was her nephew from Liège, sent to stay with her after his parents had been killed in a bombing raid. She burned his real clothes and dressed him in garments 2 sizes too large, borrowed from a boy who had died of illness the previous winter. She wrapped his hands in clean bandages and told anyone who asked that he had burned them on a stove. And most importantly, she kept him inside, hidden in the dark corners of her home, away from windows, away from prying eyes. For 3 days, Marcel lived like a ghost in that house. He barely spoke. He barely ate. He listened to the sounds of the village being torn apart outside, the shouting, the crying, the systematic destruction of anything the Germans suspected might hide evidence. He heard the gunshots too. 2 men from the village, accused of being resistance sympathizers, were executed in the square as a warning. Their bodies were left there for a full day, a message written in blood. On the 4th day, something changed. An SS officer arrived from Brussels, a man with a reputation for brutality and an obsession with rooting out partisan activity. He gathered the entire village in the church and delivered a speech that Elise would later recount to Marcel in whispers. The officer announced that the Reich knew a child had sabotaged the train. He knew the child was from this village, and he promised that if the child did not come forward within 24 hours, he would begin executing families at random, starting with those who had children matching the age profile. 5 families, 10 people, every 6 hours, until someone confessed or until someone was given up. It was a tactic the Nazis had perfected across occupied Europe. Collective punishment. Turn neighbor against neighbor. Make the cost of heroism so high that even the bravest would break. And it worked. Because by nightfall, people in the village were already whispering, already pointing fingers, already wondering which child could have done this. Marcel's name hadn't been mentioned yet, but Elise knew it was only a matter of time. That night, Elise made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She woke Marcel in the darkness and told him he had to leave. Not just the house, the village, the entire region. She had made contact with a smuggler, a man who moved refugees and resistance fighters across the border into France. He would be passing through the forest at midnight. If Marcel could reach the rendezvous point, 2 kilometers north near the old lumber mill, the smuggler would take him. It would mean leaving his mother behind. It would mean disappearing into the chaos of a continent at war, but it would also mean survival. Marcel refused. He told Elise he wouldn't let innocent people die because of what he had done. He would turn himself in. He would face the Germans. But Elise grabbed his face with both hands and forced him to look at her. She told him that if he surrendered, the Nazis would kill him anyway. And then they would kill his mother for raising a saboteur. And then they would kill Elise for hiding him. His surrender wouldn't save anyone. It would only give the Germans the satisfaction of destroying everything he had fought for. The only way to honor what he had done, the only way to make it mean something, was to survive. Marcel left the house at 11:30 that night, slipping out through the root cellar and into the frozen forest one last time. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and a small photograph of his parents that his mother had given him years before. He didn't look back at the village. He couldn't, because if he did, he knew he would never have the strength to leave. The walk to the lumber mill was the longest of his life. Every shadow looked like a German patrol. Every sound was a rifle being cocked. But he made it. And when he arrived, shivering and hollow-eyed, the smuggler was waiting. The man didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, gestured for Marcel to follow, and led him deeper into the trees. They walked for 3 days, sleeping in abandoned barns and ruins, eating whatever scraps the smuggler had brought, and on the 4th day they crossed into France. Marcel Dury had escaped. But the boy who had thrown the switch, the boy who had stopped the train, was gone forever. In his place was someone older, harder, marked by a war that had stolen his childhood and replaced it with scars. In France, Marcel became one of thousands of displaced children wandering through the ruins of a dying war. The smuggler had delivered him to a safe house in a town called Charleville-Mézières, just across the Belgian border, where a network of Catholic nuns sheltered refugees fleeing the Nazi occupation. The nuns asked no questions. They simply gave Marcel a bed, a bowl of thin soup, and a new name. For the next 3 months he was Pierre Blanc, an orphan from Normandy whose parents had been killed during the D-Day landings. It was a common enough story in 1945. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked too closely. The war had created so many orphans that one more barely registered. Marcel spent his days helping the nuns wash laundry, chop wood, and tend to the other children who arrived in the night, wide-eyed and traumatized. He never spoke about what he had done. He never mentioned the train, the switch, or the village he had left behind. But at night, when the other children were asleep, he would lie awake and wonder what had happened to his mother, whether she was still alive, whether the Gestapo had discovered the truth, whether the families in his village had been executed because of him. The answer came in April, just weeks before the war in Europe ended. A resistance courier, a young woman who had been passing through the safe house on her way to Paris, recognized Marcel. She had been part of the network in Liège and had heard about the sabotage train and the manhunt that followed. She pulled Marcel aside and told him everything. His mother was alive. The Gestapo had interrogated her for 2 days, but she had given them nothing. She had claimed complete ignorance, insisting her son had been home the entire night of the sabotage. Elise, too, had been questioned and released, but the village had paid a price. The SS officer, enraged by his failure to find the saboteur, had followed through on his threat. 3 families, 15 people in total, had been executed over the course of a week. Their names were read aloud in the church as a final warning before the Germans retreated in the face of the advancing Allied forces. Marcel listened to those names, and something inside him broke. He had saved 247 prisoners, but 15 innocent people had died because the Nazis couldn't find him. The mathematics of war, the cold calculus of resistance and reprisal, didn't make it easier. It made it unbearable. When the war officially ended on May 8, 1945, Marcel was still in France. He heard the news from the nuns who gathered the children in the courtyard and wept with joy as church bells rang across the town. People were dancing in the streets. Soldiers were embracing strangers. The nightmare was over. But for Marcel, there was no celebration, because he knew that going home meant facing the families of those 15 people. It meant looking his mother in the eye and telling her what he had done. It meant living with the knowledge that his act of heroism had cost lives as surely as it had saved them. And so for 2 more months he stayed in Charleville-Mézières, paralyzed by guilt and fear. It was his mother who finally found him. In July, she arrived at the safe house with Elise, both women thin and exhausted but alive. The reunion was not the tearful embrace Marcel had imagined. His mother simply held him for a long time, silent, and then whispered in his ear that it was time to come home, that the village needed to heal, and that he was part of that healing, whether he believed it or not. The journey back to Belgium was quiet. Marcel rode in the back of a Red Cross truck alongside other returning refugees, staring out at the landscape of devastation that stretched across the countryside. Burned-out tanks, ruined farmhouses, entire towns reduced to rubble. The war had left scars on the land that would take decades to erase. When they finally reached the village, Marcel expected anger. He expected accusations, but what he found was something far more complicated. The village had changed. The families who had lost loved ones to the reprisals were there, standing in the square, watching as Marcel stepped down from the truck. Some looked away. Some stared with expressions he couldn't read. But one woman, the mother of a boy who had been executed, walked up to him slowly. Marcel braced himself. And then she did something he never expected. She placed her hand on his head, gently, and told him that her son would have done the same thing. That bravery always came with a cost, and that he should not carry this burden alone. Not everyone in the village felt that way. There were those who believed Marcel had been reckless, that he had brought the wrath of the Gestapo down on innocent people. There were whispers that he should have stayed hidden, that he should never have come back. But there were others, the majority, who understood something deeper. That resistance under Nazi occupation was never clean, that every act of defiance carried the risk of reprisal, and that the blame for those 15 deaths belonged to the Germans who pulled the triggers, not to the 10-year-old boy who had tried to save lives. Marcel returned to school that fall. He sat in the same classroom he had left months before, surrounded by children who knew his story but didn't know how to talk about it. He was no longer just Marcel. He was the boy who had stopped the train, the boy who had fought the Nazis, the boy who had survived. And that identity, whether he wanted it or not, would follow him for the rest of his life. The years immediately after the war were supposed to bring peace, but for Marcel, they brought only silence. Belgium was rebuilding physically and emotionally, trying to stitch itself back together after 5 years of occupation. Monuments were erected for fallen soldiers. Parades honored the resistance fighters who had sabotaged railways and bridges, but Marcel's name appeared on no monument. No parade celebrated what he had done, because the truth was, most people wanted to forget. The war had been too painful, too close, too scarred with betrayal and collaboration. Villages that had once been united were now fractured by accusations of who had helped the Germans and who had resisted. And a story like Marcel's, a story where heroism and tragedy were inseparable, didn't fit the neat narrative the country was trying to build. So Marcel learned to keep quiet. He went to school, helped his mother at home, and avoided talking about that night. When classmates asked about the scar on his wrist or the way he flinched at loud noises, he changed the subject. When teachers praised the bravery of the resistance, he stared at his desk and said nothing. He had become invisible again, not because he wanted to hide, but because no one knew what to do with a child who had seen too much. His mother tried to help him move forward. She enrolled him in a technical school when he turned 14, hoping that learning a trade would give him purpose. Marcel studied mechanics, working with engines and machinery, finding a strange comfort in the logic of gears and pistons. Machines didn't judge, they didn't ask questions, they simply worked or they didn't. And for a boy who had spent years carrying the weight of impossible choices, that simplicity was a relief. He became skilled, even talented, fixing motorcycles and trucks for local businesses. By the time he was 18, he had a job at a garage in Liège, earning enough to support his mother and save a little for himself. To anyone watching, Marcel Dury was just another young man trying to build a life in post-war Europe. Quiet, hard-working, unremarkable. But at night, the dreams came. The sound of the train, the cold of the culvert, the faces of the 15 people who had died because he had survived. And Marcel would wake up gasping, soaked in sweat, wondering if he would ever truly escape that frozen February night. It wasn't until 1953, 8 years after the war ended, that Marcel's story began to resurface. A Belgian journalist named Henri Toussaint was researching a book about forgotten acts of resistance, interviewing survivors, and combing through Gestapo records that had been captured by the Allies. In a dusty file in Brussels, Toussaint found a report from the SS officer who had investigated the sabotaged train. The report described the search for a child saboteur, the collective punishment imposed on the village, and the officer's fury at being unable to solve the case. Toussaint cross-referenced the location and the date with resistance records and survivor testimonies, and slowly, painstakingly, he pieced together what had happened. When he finally tracked down Marcel, who was by then 23 years old and working as a mechanic, Toussaint asked him one simple question. Was it true? Had he really stopped that train? Marcel's first instinct was to deny it, to tell the journalist he had the wrong person. But something in Toussaint's eyes, a genuine curiosity rather than exploitation, made Marcel pause. And for the first time in 8 years, he told the story. All of it. The switch, the culvert, the escape, the guilt. Toussaint listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather journal. When Marcel finished, the journalist looked at him and said something that would change everything. He said, "The world needs to know what you did." Marcel didn't want the world to know. He had spent nearly a decade trying to forget, trying to build a normal life far away from the shadow of that night. But Toussaint was persuasive. He argued that Marcel's story wasn't just about one act of sabotage. It was about the impossible choices ordinary people faced under occupation. It was about the cost of resistance and the complexity of heroism. And most importantly, it was about remembering that wars aren't only won by generals and soldiers. They're won by children who choose bravery when every instinct screams at them to run. Reluctantly, Marcel agreed to let Toussaint publish the story. The article appeared in a Belgian newspaper in November 1953 under the headline, "The Boy Who Stopped the Nazi Train." It was a modest piece, just 3 pages, buried in the middle of the paper. Marcel assumed it would be read by a few people and then forgotten. He was wrong. Within days, the story had been picked up by newspapers across Europe. Within weeks, it had reached the United States, where it appeared in Life magazine with a dramatic illustration of a small boy pulling a frozen lever under a moonlit sky. And within months, Marcel Dury was no longer invisible. He was, whether he liked it or not, famous. The attention was overwhelming. Journalists camped outside his home, demanding interviews. Photographers followed him to work. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand or to argue about whether his actions had been justified. Some called him a hero, others called him reckless. A few bitter survivors of the reprisals called him a murderer. Marcel hated all of it. He hadn't stopped the train to become famous. He had done it because, in that moment, it had seemed like the only choice. And now the world was demanding he justify that choice over and over again. He considered disappearing, changing his name, moving to another country. But his mother convinced him to stay. She told him that the story was bigger than him now, that it belonged to history, and that running from it wouldn't make it go away. So Marcel stayed. He gave interviews when he had to. He answered questions as honestly as he could. And slowly, painfully, he began to accept that the 10-year-old boy who had crawled through a frozen culvert would always be a part of who he was. Not all of who he was, but a part he could never erase. By 1955, Marcel's story had taken on a life of its own, evolving beyond the facts into something closer to legend. American filmmakers approached him about turning his story into a movie. Publishers offered book deals. Schools across Belgium invited him to speak to students about courage and resistance. Marcel refused most of these requests. He had no interest in being a symbol or a motivational figure. But there was one invitation he couldn't refuse. In June of 1955, he received a letter from the United States War Department informing him that a group of American veterans, men who had been prisoners on that train in February 1945, wanted to meet him. They had read about his story in Life magazine and had spent months tracking him down through military records and Red Cross files. 12 of them were planning a trip to Belgium to visit the sites where they had been liberated, and they wanted Marcel to be there. The letter was signed by a man named James Callahan, a former army sergeant from Pennsylvania who had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Callahan wrote that he and the others owed their lives to a boy they had never met, and they wanted the chance to say thank you in person. Marcel agreed to the meeting, though the idea terrified him. For 10 years, the prisoners on that train had existed in his mind as abstractions, faceless names in a story he tried not to think about. But now they were real. They were men with families, careers, lives that had continued because of what he had done. The meeting was arranged for July 9th, at the site of the old rail siding where the train had been stopped. The Belgian government, eager to capitalize on the positive publicity, turned it into a small ceremony. A plaque was commissioned. Local officials gave speeches. Photographers from half a dozen newspapers lined up along the tracks. And Marcel, wearing a suit that felt 2 sizes too tight, stood in the center of it all, feeling like an imposter. He kept thinking about the 15 people who weren't there, the families who had paid the price for his act, and he wondered if the men on that train would still want to thank him if they knew the full cost of their freedom. When the American veterans arrived, stepping off a bus with their wives and children, Marcel's first instinct was to run. But then James Callahan walked up to him, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, and extended his hand. And Marcel shook it. What happened next was something Marcel would remember for the rest of his life. Callahan didn't deliver a grand speech. He didn't call Marcel a hero or try to turn the moment into something it wasn't. He simply looked at Marcel and said, "I have 3 daughters. The oldest is 10 years old, and I cannot imagine her doing what you did." Then, one by one, the other veterans introduced themselves. Robert Chen, a medic from California. Thomas O'Neill, a radio operator from Boston. Frank Delacroix, a rifleman from Louisiana. Each of them told Marcel where they had been when the train stopped, what they had been thinking, how close they had come to giving up hope. Several of them cried. One man, a former corporal named Eugene Bradford, handed Marcel a photograph of his family, 4 children and a wife, standing in front of a house in Michigan. Bradford told Marcel that none of them would exist if that train had reached its destination, that his entire family, his entire future, was built on the foundation of what a 10-year-old boy had done in the dark. And Marcel, who had carried guilt for a decade, felt something shift inside him. Not absolution, not peace, but a crack in the wall he had built around that night. After the ceremony, the veterans and their families stayed in Belgium for 3 more days. They visited the village where Marcel had grown up, now rebuilt, but still scarred by memories. They met with some of the families who had lost loved ones to the reprisals, conversations that were awkward and painful but necessary, and they spent time with Marcel, not as a symbol or a story, but as a person. They asked him about his life, his work, his dreams. They treated him like a friend, not a monument. And for the first time since the war, Marcel felt like he could breathe. On their last night in Belgium, the group gathered for dinner at a small restaurant in Liège. Wine was poured, toasts were made, and James Callaghan stood up and said something that would stay with Marcel forever. He said, "We came here to thank you. But I think what we really came here to do was to remind you that what you did mattered, not just because it saved us, but because it proved that even in the darkest moments, even when the whole world is burning, one person can make a difference, and that matters more than you know." Marcel returned to his quiet life after the veterans left, but something had changed. He began accepting more speaking invitations, traveling to schools and veterans organizations to tell his story. Not because he wanted fame, but because he realized that the story wasn't really about him. It was about the choices people make under impossible circumstances. It was about the cost of resistance and the weight of survival. And it was about ensuring that future generations understood what fascism looked like when it arrived in their villages, their streets, their lives. Marcel spoke plainly, without drama or embellishment. He told the truth, including the parts that made him uncomfortable. He talked about the 15 people who had died. He talked about the guilt that still woke him up at night. And he talked about the lesson he had learned from the American veterans, that heroism wasn't about being fearless or perfect. It was about doing what you believed was right, even when the cost was unbearable. And that sometimes the most important thing you could do was survive long enough to tell the story. Marcel's life took another unexpected turn in 1962 when he received a letter from West Germany. It was from a man named Klaus Werner, a former Wehrmacht officer who had been assigned to investigate the sabotage train back in 1945. Werner, now in his 50s and living in Hamburg, had read about Marcel's story in a German newspaper and felt compelled to reach out. The letter was remarkable for its honesty. Werner wrote that he had spent 17 years trying to forget the war, trying to bury the things he had seen and the orders he had followed. But Marcel's story had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding. Werner had been the one who examined the frozen switch, who measured the footprints in the snow, who reported to his superiors that a child had likely been responsible. He had been the one who recommended the collective punishment strategy that led to the executions. And now, nearly 2 decades later, he was writing to apologize. Not to ask for forgiveness, he was clear about that, but simply to acknowledge the truth. That he had been part of a machine designed to crush resistance through terror, and that machine had destroyed innocent lives because a boy had chosen bravery. Marcel didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to burn the letter and forget it had ever arrived. But another part, the part that had spent years trying to make sense of what had happened, was curious. He wrote back. And over the next 3 years, Marcel and Klaus Werner exchanged more than 30 letters, an unlikely correspondence between a resistance hero and a former enemy officer. They wrote about guilt, responsibility, and the impossible moral landscape of war. Werner never tried to excuse his actions. He was blunt about the fact that he had followed orders he knew were evil, because he had been afraid of what would happen if he didn't. Marcel, in turn, shared his own struggles with the weight of his choices, and through these letters both men found something unexpected. Not friendship exactly, but a shared understanding of how war destroys everyone it touches, regardless of which side they were on. Their correspondence ended in 1965 when Werner died of a heart attack. But before he died, he sent Marcel one final letter. In it, he wrote that their exchange had given him something he hadn't thought possible, the ability to face his own history without hiding from it. And he thanked Marcel for that. The 1970s brought a new wave of interest in World War II resistance stories, as historians began to focus on the untold narratives of ordinary people who had fought back against occupation. Marcel was interviewed dozens of times, his story appearing in documentaries, history books, and academic papers. He retired from his job as a mechanic in 1978 and spent his later years traveling across Europe, speaking at schools, museums, and memorials. He was awarded several medals, including the Belgian Resistance Medal and a special commendation from the French government. But the recognition he valued most came in 1981, when a small memorial was erected in his home village. It wasn't dedicated to him alone. It honored all the victims of the Nazi reprisals, listing the names of the 15 people who had been executed. And at the bottom, in smaller letters, it included a single line: "In memory of those who paid the price for resistance, and in honor of those who dared to resist." Marcel attended the unveiling ceremony with his mother, who was by then in her 80s. She stood beside him as the cloth was pulled away from the stone, and she whispered something he would never forget. She said, "They're all part of the same story now, and the story is bigger than any one of us." Marcel married late in life, at the age of 52, to a schoolteacher named Marguerite, who had heard him speak at a veterans event in Brussels. They had no children, but Marguerite often joked that Marcel had thousands of children in the form of the students who had heard his story and been inspired by it. They lived quietly in a small apartment in Liège, where Marcel tended a garden and Marguerite graded papers, and they spent their evenings reading or listening to the radio. It was a simple life, the kind of life Marcel had once dreamed of back when he was 10 years old and the world was still at war. But it was also a life shaped by history. Marcel could never fully escape what he had done. The scars on his wrists were still there. The nightmares, though less frequent, still came. And every February, on the anniversary of that night, he would wake up in the dark and remember the cold, the fear, the sound of the train. But he had learned to live with it. He had learned that some burdens couldn't be put down, only carried, and that carrying them with honesty and grace was its own form of courage. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings, Marcel was invited to Normandy to participate in a series of commemorations honoring the Allied liberation of Europe. He was 70 years old by then, his hair white, his hands gnarled from decades of mechanical work. But when he stood on the beach at Omaha and looked out at the sea where thousands of young men had given their lives, he felt the same thing he had felt as a boy standing beside those frozen tracks. That history was not an abstraction. It was made by people, ordinary people, terrified people, people who chose to act even when acting seemed impossible. A journalist asked him that day what he wanted people to remember about the war. Marcel thought for a long moment, and then he said, "I want them to remember that evil doesn't announce itself with horns and fire. It arrives quietly, in uniforms, with paperwork and rules, and the only thing that stops it is people who refuse to look away, people who choose to do something, even when the cost is unbearable. That's the only lesson that matters." Marcel Dury lived to see the turn of the millennium, a feat that seemed impossible for a boy who had once crawled through a frozen culvert expecting to die. He spent his final years in relative peace, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of daily life in Liège. Marguerite passed away in 2001, and Marcel, then 76 years old, found himself alone for the first time in decades. But he wasn't forgotten. Students still wrote to him, asking for interviews for school projects. Historians still called requesting clarification on details of that night in February 1945. And every year, on the anniversary of the sabotage, a small group of people, some descendants of the liberated prisoners, some simply admirers of his story, would gather at the rail siding to lay flowers and remember. Marcel attended when his health allowed, always quietly, always uncomfortable with the attention. He would stand at the back of the crowd, hands in his pockets, and listen as someone read the names of the 15 villagers who had been executed. And then, when it was over, he would walk to the spot where the switch had been, long since replaced by modern equipment, and stand there for a moment in silence. What he thought about in those moments, he never told anyone. But those who knew him suspected he was talking to ghosts, apologizing, explaining, asking for understanding from people who could no longer answer. In 2003, Marcel was diagnosed with lung cancer, likely the result of decades spent breathing in fumes from engines and machinery. The prognosis was grim, 6 months, maybe a year if he was lucky. He declined aggressive treatment, telling his doctors that he had lived a long life and wasn't afraid of what came next. Instead, he spent his final months doing something unexpected. He began writing. Not a memoir in the traditional sense, but a series of letters addressed to no one in particular. letters to the 15 villagers who had died, letters to the prisoners he had saved, letters to Klaus Werner, the German officer who had apologized, letters to his younger self, the 10-year-old boy who had made an impossible choice. In these letters, Marcel wrote with a rawness he had never shown in public. He wrote about his regrets, his doubts, his anger at a world that had forced a child to carry such weight. He wrote about the moments of beauty he had found in the wreckage, the kindness of strangers, the unexpected friendships, the quiet dignity of people who refused to surrender to hate. And he wrote about what he believed in the end his life had meant. Not that he was a hero. He had never accepted that label, but that he was proof that resistance was possible. That even in the face of overwhelming evil, even when the odds were impossible, one person could matter. Marcel died on November 17, 2004, at the age of 79. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, alone in his apartment, with the letters he had written stacked neatly on the table beside his bed. The funeral was held in the same church where the Gestapo had once gathered the village to threaten collective punishment. Hundreds of people attended. Veterans from America and Britain, some in wheelchairs, some barely able to walk. Historians and journalists who had spent years documenting resistance movements, students who had been inspired by his story. And of course the people of the village, the descendants of those who had lived through the occupation, the executions, the liberation. The priest who delivered the eulogy spoke about the complexity of Marcel's legacy. He didn't shy away from the painful parts. He acknowledged that Marcel's act of sabotage had led to reprisals. He acknowledged that some in the village had never fully forgiven him. But he also said something important. He said that Marcel had spent his entire life trying to make sense of an impossible situation, and that his willingness to face that complexity, to refuse easy answers, to carry the weight of both heroism and tragedy, was perhaps the most heroic thing of all, because it would have been easier to deny the cost, to paint himself as a pure hero. But Marcel had never done that. He had told the truth. And the truth, messy and painful as it was, mattered. After the funeral, Marcel's letters were donated to the Belgian War Museum in Brussels, where they remain part of the permanent collection. Historians who have studied them describe them as some of the most honest accounts of moral decision-making under occupation ever written. Because Marcel didn't try to justify himself. He didn't claim he had made the only choice or the right choice. He simply described what it felt like to be a child in a world gone mad, forced to decide between doing nothing and doing something that might save lives or cost them. And in that honesty, those letters became a teaching tool. Schools across Europe now use them to help students understand that history isn't made by perfect people. It's made by flawed, frightened, ordinary people who do their best in impossible circumstances. And sometimes their best is extraordinary, and sometimes it comes with a cost that can never be fully reconciled. But the attempt to do something, to refuse to be a bystander, still matters. It mattered in 1945, and it matters now. In 2007, 3 years after Marcel's death, the European Union established the Marcel Dury Award for Youth Resistance and Civic Courage, given annually to young people who have taken extraordinary action in the face of injustice. The award isn't about military heroism. It's about ordinary kids who see something wrong in their communities and choose to act, kids who stand up to bullies, kids who organize protests against corruption, kids who hide refugees or speak out against hate. The first recipient was a 15-year-old girl from Romania who had created an underground network to help Roma families escape human trafficking. When she accepted the award, she gave a speech that echoed something Marcel had once said. She said, "I'm not brave. I was just tired of watching people suffer and doing nothing. And if a 10-year-old boy in Belgium could stop a Nazi train, then I could do this." That's the legacy Marcel left behind. Not a statue or a monument, though those exist too, but the idea that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and acting anyway. It's about understanding that the world doesn't change because of grand gestures by extraordinary people. It changes because of small, desperate acts by ordinary people who refuse to look away. Today, more than 80 years after that frozen February night, Marcel Dury's story remains largely unknown outside of Belgium and a small circle of World War II historians. There's no Hollywood movie, no best-selling biography, no viral documentary that's been watched by millions, and in a way, that's exactly how Marcel would have wanted it. Because his story was never about fame or recognition. It was about the quiet, desperate calculus that ordinary people make when the world around them descends into darkness. It was about the impossible question that millions faced under Nazi occupation. Do you stay silent and survive, or do you act and risk everything? Marcel chose to act. And that choice, made by a 10-year-old boy with frozen hands and a heart full of fear, saved 247 lives. But it also cost 15 lives, and Marcel carried both of those truths until the day he died. He never pretended the math was simple. He never claimed his heroism erased the tragedy. He simply told the truth and let history decide what it meant. The rail line where Marcel threw that switch still exists, though it's been modernized beyond recognition. The manual lever is long gone, replaced by computerized systems and automated signals. The village where he grew up has changed too, transformed by decades of peace and prosperity into a quiet suburban community where most residents have no idea what happened there in 1945. The memorial stone still stands in the village square, though few people stop to read it anymore. The names of the 15 victims are weathered but legible, and at the bottom, that single line about resistance and its price remains a testament to the complexity of moral choices in wartime. Tourists occasionally pass through, guided by history buffs or researchers retracing the roots of Nazi occupation. But for the most part, Marcel's story has faded into the vast ocean of untold World War II narratives, millions of acts of courage, large and small, that shaped the outcome of the war, but never made it into the history books we read in school. And yet, the story endures in the ways that matter most. In classrooms across Europe, teachers still use Marcel's letters to spark discussions about ethical decision-making. In military academies, officers study his act of sabotage as an example of asymmetric resistance, and in families descended from those liberated prisoners, the name Marcel Dury is spoken with reverence, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren, as a reminder that their very existence is built on the courage of a child they never met. James Callahan's great-granddaughter, a college student in Pennsylvania, carries a photograph of Marcel in her wallet. She's never been to Belgium. She never met the man who saved her great-grandfather's life. But she knows his story. And she knows that without him, without that impossible act on that frozen night, she wouldn't be here. That's the real legacy. Not monuments or awards, but lives. Generations of lives that exist because one boy refused to do nothing. So why don't more people know about Marcel Dury? Why isn't his name mentioned alongside the famous resistance fighters and war heroes we celebrate? Perhaps because his story is too complicated for the simple narratives we prefer. Perhaps because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of resistance and the weight of moral choices. Or perhaps because, in the end, Marcel was exactly what he always claimed to be. Not a hero, just a terrified child who did what he thought was right and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that meant. But here's what we should remember. The next time someone tells you that one person can't make a difference, that the forces of history are too large for individual action to matter, remember the boy who stopped a Nazi train. Remember that evil doesn't triumph because it's strong. It triumphs because good people convince themselves they're too small to fight back. Marcel Dury was 10 years old, freezing, alone, and terrified. And he changed history anyway. That's not just a story about the past, it's a reminder about the present and a challenge for the future.